So I'm John Stevens. I'm the curator of the Queen's Own Rifles of Canada Regimental Museum and Archives. And for our first episode of Museum Conversations, I'm joined by Major Scott Moody, who is the commanding officer designate of the regiment, scheduled to take over later this month. And we'll get to that in a little bit. But welcome, Scott. Thank you for taking the time. I know you're a school principal, and this is a crazy time of year for you. And I know with the regiment trying to start things up again is also going to be challenging. So appreciate you taking the time to talk to me today.
Thank you for speaking with me. Yeah, appreciate it.
So we're going to talk about your military career, and I guess we'll start right at the beginning. You joined a long time back when you were still in high school, and you joined the Queen's Own Rifles. So what made you want to join the reserves and in the first place? Was there any kind of family history of military service, or?
Yeah, I was. I guess I had a couple influences in my life to join the military, and I guess the first one and probably the largest one was my grandfather, Tom Moody, and Tom was my paternal grandfather, and he had served in the Essex Regiment, which was in the UK's, and during his service, he's actually in the TA and militia prior to the war starting, and it was his part-time job that he had, and then when the war started, he went into full-time service right in 1939, and he served. He landed on Normandy on D-Day with the Essex Regiment, I think on the third wave of that first day, and ended up fighting throughout Europe right up into ending in Germany. So, and he went up and down the ranks, some interesting stories there. So he went from sergeant to private to corporal to, and back up there, ending as a sergeant major. And he ended up in occupied Germany after the war, and served there for quite a while. And afterwards, he immigrated to Canada in the 50s with my grandmother and my dad. But he was a key influence. I was raised by him. I had the great pleasure of having both my parents and my grandparents in the same house, and was a party to many of his stories, and some good. And as I got older and he started understanding my military service, some not so good. And that was a big influence. My second one was, and because of him, I ended up in the Army Cadets, and I served in the 748 Governor General's Horse Guards Army Cadets, which time from the time I was about 13 till the time I was 18. And during that time, I had the great pleasure of serving with, or taking a course called Wilderness Leadership Course, which you may have heard of. Yeah. On that course, it's run by members at the time of the Canadian Airborne Regiment, and they provided the instructional cadre on that, and it was quite an experience. Definitely made me have a great deal of respect for the airborne way, and during that course, they actually gave us some career guidance, and at the time I wasn't sure what to do, and they were trying to influence me to go into the military or at least join the reserves. I was 16 at the time, so the next thing I knew, I found myself at the recruiting center, a little bit lost and thinking that I wanted to go to the regular force or apply to RMC or do something like that. And after finding out that I was colorblind and some of my options were limited, I found my way into the Queen's Own Rifles recruiting office, and went from there.
So in those days, you actually would go to a particular regiment to
that's right,
to join up.
In fact, the regiment came to my high school, and it was actually Sean Kelly.
Oh, really?
Yeah. So he was a Master Corporal or Sergeant at the time. He came to my high school, and he was there, and I had a discussion with him. He was in cadets, and we had a very how do I join piece, and then I went back and followed up and ended up in the Queen's Own.
And for those who might not know, Sean became the RSM and is now in his retirement the deputy curator for our museum as well. So yeah, a lot of interesting connections there. So besides that, was the airborne tasking part of that reason for wanting to come to the Queen's Own Rifles, or?
Yeah, absolutely. It had a big influence. My grandfather definitely didn't want me to go in the infantry. And when I told him I was going to join the Queen, I had this really interesting story with my grandfather. My family church or where a lot of our family was married was St. Paul's. And when I was at St. Paul's one day, there was the cenotaph, and I didn't know who it was. I didn't know about it. I was 13 years old, and my grandfather explained to me what it was for, and that it was the Queen's Own Rifles, and he spoke very highly of them at the time. But that being said, as I started showing my interest in joining the military, he tried to talk me out of joining the infantry, right? And and he saw during Normandy, particularly where he had landed and where he ended up. I mean, he saw some of the aftermath, and he was actually with 30th Armored Corps as they pushed in during the push into Holland during a market guard. So he saw some of the carnage and the unfortunate impact of being a paratrooper at times. So he wanted me to be an engineer. He said that's probably a safer job, and
Right.
so I ended up in the infantry because I was colorblind, right? So that was kind of one of those strange things that took place. But it's from then on, zero impact on me, right? I guess.
And it seems to have worked out. Yeah.
Yeah.
So do you remember your first jump?
I do. Yeah. I had the great fortune of getting on my jump course pretty quickly. I completed my basic training in my infantry course, and then within a few months I was slated to go on the basic para, and I had the because I did it in 1993, so quite a while ago now, I guess. And that was in Edmonton, so I flew out to Edmonton.
Right.
I'd never been to Edmonton before, and when I was there, it was a great course. Loved it. Most of the course was from 3 PPCLI that were participating in the course. A lot of them had just returned from a UN tour, and during that time, I did a lot of reflection on, jumping out of an airplane, and I tried to rationalize it to myself. So on that first jump, I kept saying to myself, well, at least I'm not getting shot at, right? And it could be worse, and that's how I justified it. And but I do remember the silence. You go from the loud noise of the aircraft's engines, and then exiting to the silence, and that was unique. And then I remember people getting in trouble as they came down, the hooting and hollering, and the instructors on the ground with the megaphones saying, be quiet, So, but yeah, it went fast, and it was a fantastic opportunity.
That's great. I have the one downside with military jumping generally is that you're actually jumping pretty low most of the time, right? And
that's right.
You're not in the air for very long. So for those people who actually like that part of the jump, have you ever done sports parachuting where you've done anything?
I have. It's a very different experience, and even when you jump static line, from a sports perspective, you're at 3,000 feet, right? Yeah. And we're at 1,250 on our first jump, and then it drops down to 1,000. That 1,000 feet goes very quickly, and I've had a few where that 1,000 feet went very quickly to the point where I wasn't able to release my equipment, and made for an interesting landing, right?
Yes, so, I can imagine.
Yeah.
So how many jumps have you had so far?
That's a good question. I tried my best to keep a good record of it after I hit 100 jumps, static line jumps in 2007. And I think I'm pretty sure I've surpassed 200 at this time. So I was trying to go back and count it, and I've done a bad job at accounting for it. So, right. Jumps, and then as a jump master, dispatches. One of my prides is as a jump master is the opportunity to both dispatch and jump at the same time. It's quite the rush and an incredible experience.
So after that, you did something a little more mundane and went to university to get a degree in kinesiology. And meanwhile, you're continuing on with your training, and then you had an opportunity to go on up Palladium. Can you tell me a little bit about that? Yeah, absolutely.
So I definitely wanted to go on a UN tour, and at the time in the mid 90s, it was Yugoslavia and either Croatia or Bosnia was the place to go. And after a lot of attempts to go, and it goes back as far as 1992 when I was a young private, where I remember being on the parade square and them asking, who wants to go to Somalia in September, and I literally was just off my course, and I really, really wanted to go, and I didn't get the opportunity. Obviously, I was low on the merit list.
Sure.
And then after that, I attempted to go to Cyprus. That didn't work out. And then Croatia in '94. That didn't, you know, I went through the process of applying, and then finally the stars aligned, and I had the opportunity to go on Palladium Roto 2, which was right. It was the transition. Palladium was the transition from the UN to a NATO mission. So we didn't wear blue berets, and NATO was who was in charge of the mission. And I went on that operation with 1RCR. So I was with Delta Company 1RCR.
And so before you go, there's obviously pre-deployment training that takes place. What did that involve for this particular rotation?
So the interesting point to note with workup training back then was when you were, so I had a bit of an advantage, and I had a really unique experience, because at the time I was in university. At one point they made me transfer. I had to transfer from the Queen's Own to the 4th Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment in London. So I transferred probably around 90, 95, 96. And I was, spent a lot of time commuting back and forth to Toronto, and I didn't own a car, and it was the Greyhound, it was getting a bit much. So I did transfer, and I had completed my leadership training, my junior leadership course, and I'd qualified to be a sergeant and at the time. So, but what had happened was, although I was a qualified sergeant, I was holding the rank of corporal to get promoted to Master Corporal at the time. When we showed up to the battalion, they basically went over your contracts, and every reservist was for the most part, was demoted. So I went down from supposed to be a Master Corporal. I went down to the rank of private, no hook private, and it was just the way they did the contracts at the time. When you showed up, they basically, the first step was to take us to the range and get everyone qualified in their individual skills. And we went to Connaught Range. And then after that, we got introduced to our section and worked our way up. So we spent a week working with our section, then our platoon, then the company, then the battalion. And with the unique thing with 1RCR in the pre-deployment training was that they were a mechanized unit. So for me, I hadn't worked in a mech environment, and that was some unique learning. Although as a private, my engagement was relatively limited in the mech side of it. I usually just fell out of the back of the vehicle, but I was qualified as a machine gunner, so that I was able to work in the turret as well at times. So, but yeah, it was a good introduction. We basically spent a good 4 months of workup training, getting right up to the brigade level. And you realize sometimes it's not always that exciting, because when you're the rear, rear company, rear section of the rear platoon of the rear company, you can spend a week, spend a lot of time in the back of a vehicle. But it was still an excellent experience. And we did some work on operations other than war, so providing humanitarian aid and riot control, things similar to that. And then we deployed. And when we deployed, it was right during the ice storms. So we were flying out of Trenton when I was hearing about this, like the ice storm had hit all around Trenton, and it was quite the thing to see. And we're hearing about the military getting deployed out, and we flew over to Bosnia at the time. So we landed into some better weather.
So was your grandfather still alive at that time to know that you actually got a mechanized tasking for a change?
Yeah, he was. Yeah, he was. He's quite proud of me going, and that was an interesting one, that's for sure. Yeah.
Traditionally, over the history of the Canadian military, there has been varying degrees of respect, perhaps is the word, between the regular forces and the militia. And of course, in the early days, the militia far outnumbered the reg force. And how did you find that in this particular deployment, in terms of how you were kind of treated, or how well you were able to integrate into what was going on?
Yeah, there was a unique rivalry that went on, particularly in this situation where many of the regular force members actually felt that the reservists were taking their job, particularly because there were some members that came over of higher ranks, for instance, a warrant officer to replace a warrant officer in the regular force. And, obviously there was a reason for that, and that was to help offset the demand that had been going on in the operational tempo for the regular force members. But, there was still some animosity that went on. And I remember my first night showing up and people running around, saying negative things about reservists and some not such nice ways at times. And but it was quite funny because I was in 4 RCR and I was wearing my RCR cap badge, so people would just kind of walk away from me and not really pay attention to it, and or not know. So I had a bit of a
Right.
force shield around me, and that was okay. But it was still I did see a lot of that. But with time, it changes, and really it's proving yourself. And for some reservists, they went over there completely unprepared, right? Some of them were very young. I remember a guy being there who was 18 years old or just turned 18. Another member, and some people weren't fit when they showed up. And I came up, I'd studied phys ed in university and been an athlete. So when I showed up, I was relatively fit, and when there was fitness tests and things like that, I mean, I think I proved myself as a capable member of the team, but more so, I was able to apply that and work hard. And once they see a strong work ethic and they see, you have some competency in your basic skills and you're fit, the respect is there, and the camaraderie builds very quickly. A vast majority of the regular force members that were in my section, for instance, had all served in the reserves. Actually, oddly, a lot of them had been in 4 RCR at the time and had just transferred to the regular force. So, they had different knowledge of the reserves, and that was, part of that experience was learning, the impact the reserves has in really supporting the regular force by providing trained soldiers that can fill their serials, specifically when they need to deploy. But a lot of these guys had transferred to the regular force, right?
Right. So the other day was National or International Dog Day or something, and you'll see my dog has now tried to join the conversation. He likes to Zoom bomb these calls. And you posted a picture of you became a dog handler. We'll come to that in a minute, but what were you doing when you first got over there? What actually was the role you were playing?
So I went over as a rifleman. Like I was the #1 rifleman Charlie team, right? And essentially I was the guy who did a lot of the jobs that other people didn't want to do. So when I arrived in Bosnia, we were in a camp called Zagan, or Camp Maple Leaf at the time. And there's a whole process of transition that you start in one camp and you move to another to eventually get to where you're supposed to be. And at the time I was with Delta Company, and Delta Company was in a place called Zagan, which is just outside the town of Cluj, which is, had a unique history to itself. And we were staying in an old factory. And my first couple of weeks there, I think we were just, as the handover was taking place from the battalion that we're taking over from, I found myself doing some pretty unique jobs. I actually did I bunted, which is the ribbons that you put around a table. Probably the entire tables in the camp mess hall, and all over all throughout were required. So I acquired some unique skills in that. And then after a while, we got out there and started patrolling on a regular basis, and I had a great experience there.
I probably should have started with the 2-minute version of why we were there in the first place. You would like to assume that everyone knows, but as you pointed out, it was quite some time ago now, and I'm sure there's a whole generation of people that may not be as familiar about what the situation was. Are you able to give us that?
Yeah, I can give you a very brief rundown. So, particularly in Yugoslavia, there's the trickle-down effect from the fall of the communism in the Soviet Union and the satellite states. In the late 80s, early 90s, a lot of countries that were, supported by the Soviet Union started to fall apart and started to seek independence based on their nations. And so you had a breakaway in Yugoslavia that started with Slovenia and followed by Croatia and then Bosnia, which created a great deal of division within the country. And Yugoslavia, which later became known as Serbia, they wanted to keep the country together. And so there was some conflict going on, and it was an ethnic conflict to some extent, and it was, there was a lot. It was very deep and complex because, you might have two different cultural groups that were at conflict, but when you look at land and territory where some of the lines were drawn in the sand, it impacted others. So the United Nations went over there with as a peacekeeping force. In which they were to ensure that the protecting civilians, but also ensuring that the conflict was minimized and that impact on civilians was minimized. But that didn't really work very well, and there was a great deal of difficulty in Yugoslavia as things escalated, and there was a variety of different actions that took place that were, both on the humanitarian front and on the legal fronts that were very concerning. So NATO eventually got involved. They went in pretty in an aggressive stance and reestablished peace. And the thing about UN peacekeeping forces, they don't always necessarily have a lot of force. They show up usually with an infantry battalion that can support itself, and there's not a lot of other fighters and aircraft that support them. So with NATO, you had a larger base of support that existed, and once again, it came when NATO got involved, the United States got involved, and that was a bit of a game changer as well over there. So I went over as part of that NATO mission, and that transition was in '96, and so I deployed at late '97 and into '98.
And so in the particular places you were trying to keep combatants apart, or
yeah, I mean,
groups apart.
Yeah, there was ethnic conflict that still existed, and there was lines that were drawn. There was an accord called the Dayton Accord that we were reinforcing, and some of that was bringing people back to their homes because of the conflict. If you were Serbian, you may have been moved to a certain city or a certain area. If you're Croatian, you may have moved somewhere else to be safe. And part of that Dayton Accord was the returning of displaced persons to the rightful places. And that was the largest conflict or theme in that tour was the impact of DPRE movement back to where they had originated from, because things had changed, and the ethnic landscape had changed quite a bit in those cities, and that made it really, or in those districts or areas, however you want to frame it, and that was creating a great deal of conflict, right? So our job was to presence patrol. That was a big part of it. Visit some cantonment sites, which were holding weapons, so do some humanitarian support, although that wasn't a huge part of it. But we did support, do small patrols to areas where maybe people were struggling with food and water. But a lot of presence patrolling by both foot and in our vehicles.
So I think Apollo came over because he wanted to hear about the dog handling part.
Sure.
So how did that come about?
So the on the tour, my company was moved from a place from Zagan, which I previously mentioned, to a town called Drvar, and during the reason we were moved there was the town of Drvar had previously been under predominantly Serbian population in that town. However, there was some actions that had taken place by Croatia, where a lot of Serbian people had left, and Croatia had kind of dominated the area. It was still part of Bosnia, but it was annexed, and there was some conflict around that. But we were moving back Serbian DPREs to that area, and there wasn't a positive response by people who are now living in that town. So there was a lot of houses being burnt down. There was a lot of damage taking place. And when my company moved in, we had some support from the British Army. They were, if I remember it correctly, they were overseeing our sector. I think we were sector northwest at the time, northeast. And that was where the command at the time, I think, was British. So we had some British dog handlers that were with us. And there was two of them, and they were there to support us both with patrol armed true dogs, which were basically, area protection dogs. They would, if there's somebody doing something wrong in an area, they would be a visual deterrent, and they could chase somebody down, and they would bite them on the right arm. And then second to that,
kind of like a police dog kind of.
Yeah, like they're not necessarily, there's different categories. There's military working dogs, there's explosive dogs, and these dogs specifically were protection dogs, right? But we also had a dog with us that was EOD, or a bomb dog, and that was handled. And so when they arrived to support us, they brought both an EOD and two patrol dogs. And as the journey went, it was a bit of a roller coaster ride while we were there. We were living in a schoolhouse called 153. And in that schoolhouse, we left, and every time we'd leave, something else would happen in the town. So we'd have to go back. We'd go back and forth. And then finally, I think it was the third time, there was a murder in the town where a couple, I think they were elderly, were killed in the town. And that was a big moment that had taken place, because it shouldn't have taken, it was quite, and some of the members of Charles Company 1 RCR who responded to it, I think it was, I don't remember the exact story, but it was pretty impactful on them. But we ended up having to go back. And eventually it turned into a riot. And I always remember we'd actually left again, and then this riot broke out in Drvar, and it was called the Drvar Riot. There's some different stories on it, but I always remember coming down the hill. There was a large switchback hill to come into the town of Drvar. And the interesting thing about Drvar was it was where a lot of fighting happened during World War II. And it was actually a German airborne operation took place there, and it wasn't very successful. And Tito had defended the area quite well, because it was surrounded by hills. The Drvar was in a floodplain. And you could see that the aftermath of that, 50 years later, it was still there. But during the Drvar riots, there's a lot of damage taking place, and there was some fire trucks and garbage trucks and water trucks that were donated, and the people that were riding lit them on fire and had driven them into the fence. And we had basically had we were in a school, and surrounding the school was a compound full of that was where DPREs had moved into. It was almost like a condominium complex. And while they were in there, the local population weren't very happy about the Serbian refugees moving back in, and it created this pretty significant conflict and riots. And so we came down. I remember coming down, and I think there was something like 80 houses on fire. And just seeing that was just like I couldn't believe what we saw. And we drove through the town, and we were trying to figure out what was going on. And it was quite an interesting day. But one of the pieces was there was the British dog handlers. One of them had, I don't know if he was injured or he got sick or something like that, but he left one of his dogs in the schoolhouse kennel. It was basically a room, and there was a big debate over who's going to get the dog out of the room. And someone came to me and said, "Oh, you know dogs, right?" And I was like, "Oh, I don't know, right? I guess, right?" So why don't you get the dog out of the room? So I ended up like trying to do it. I don't think I actually did it, but I volunteered to do it. Anyways, what had happened though, they saw during the riots that the dogs were a pretty effective tool, right? And they were very helpful as a non-lethal means of deterring the violence, right? And so after that, there was an opportunity for, I can't remember, it was 5 or 6 of us to go on a familiarization course. So I think it was like 2 or 3 days, and to familiarize ourselves with how to work with the dog and their capabilities, just in case we have to work with a handler. So I went on the course. And I'd like to think it was because I merited high and I was a really good guy, but I think it was more just because I was the young guy who had the really bad leave block. So basically I showed up to Bosnia, I had my 3-week leave, and then I didn't have another leave for like 5 months after that or something. So I think I just fit the criteria to go on this course, because I could continue to do the job after I was trained.
Right.
So then what happened was they said, well, we're going to run a course for you guys and get you qualified. So that was really neat. So I ended up actually taking the course in Drvar, and they brought the dogs. The dog handler came, ran a course for us during the day, and at night we did the practical component, which was patrolling, and we did it under the supervision of the instructor. But then after a while, we kind of had a gradual release of responsibility with that, and we could do it on our own. And then we had to do a couple tests. We had to do a test both in a handling test, where the dog was tested on his ability to chase somebody. And so every day on the course, you had to dress up in a tracksuit and put a protective arm on, and then you get bit about 5-6 times a day. And we would then practice the commands. We'd say them in Serbo-Croatian: stoj, stani ili puštam, stop or release my dog. And then if they didn't, you would release your dog. and the dog would then, chase down the person and bite them on the right arm. And then you'd have to try to get the dog off of them. Well, and then we would just go through that practice over and over again. And then there was some obedience work that we would do with the dogs as well, which was hand signals. And, so that was the test. And so the course was typically, I think, 4 weeks long, and we did it in about a 2-week time period. And then afterwards, there was about 6 of us qualified at the time. And then a bunch of us got put into the role, so became a company asset essentially, and so it was myself and another guy that did the job for the most part over there, and
So
rotated between a few other.
At that point, are they assigning you a dog, or?
Yeah, they assigned a dog. So the dog I had on course was another. I ended up with another dog, and the dogs are interchangeable for the most part. Whether you don't want to keep doing it, but I could use my partner's dog, no problem. But you kind of get a dog that you get used to working with, and I had my dog Sam, who was the key one, and that's kind of the post that I did, or when I was talking about this dog Sam work with me, because years later, it was actually 2 years ago, I got a call from a reporter who was working for I think Maple Leaf Magazine, and they're saying, "Oh, are you the? Were you?" It was actually on Facebook. Someone said, "Who is a dog handler in Drvar?" And my buddy's like, "Oh, I know Scott Moody." And then so he added me or whatever it was, and I ended up responding to the person, and they said, "Did you know your dog won the Dickens Medal?" And I'm like, "The what?" And just the highest honor for an animal. And I was very, I didn't know, and I was kind of remembering a few things that we did and why it would have won it. But there was an incident when I was a handler, or I think I was on the course where the dog had, and where we'd been called to it. The handler at the time was the instructor on the course, and it was I can't remember exactly what happened in the citation. It basically says the dog took down an armed person that was quite belligerent, and had done a whole bunch of things during the riots, which was true. So he'd been awarded this medal, and Sam was a really good dog, and so it was neat to learn about this dog and winning the medal.
Yeah.
Dickens medal. I didn't even know what that was at the time, so no one actually told me, and not that I was the handler at the time, but still, I got to work with the dog on a regular basis, right? So, but yeah, that was the experience, and I did the job pretty well up until the end of the tour, and then the dogs got handed over, and the battalion that took over for us was 3 RCR, and 3 RCR sent in about 6 people on the course as well, and they handled the dogs, and I didn't hear much about it afterwards. So.
Does the Canadian Forces have dogs?
They do in different capacities. It was funny when I came back from the tour, someone had called me about doing a study on the capability of dogs and if I'd be interested in being part of that. But later on, when I deployed to Afghanistan, there was private companies that were using dogs.
Right.
I think the military police and it might be at this special operations level that dogs are being employed. So right now.
So during the length of this deployment, besides your dog handling, was there anything in particular that stood out to you, an experience that was particularly moving or impactful on you? Or?
Well, it was very interesting to see the damage, right? And sometimes, we would travel somewhere and I'd be like, wow, what happened? What happened here? And they're like, well, no, and someone who knew the area, often the language assistant, they would share with us, well, actually, this isn't from the conflict of the 90s. This is from World War II, right? And some of the battlefields, like I said, in Drvar, there was gliders that were used by the Germans when they attacked Drvar, and I think it was 44, and you could see them still scattered around, right?
Wow.
So you can see the history of conflict there. That was interesting, but also the sheer damage, and what I mean by that is, we did a lot of there's a lot of remains repatriations going on there, specifically around some of the mass graves. So there was a lot of some of the details that we received was to go observe and support the UN teams that were, doing the identifications and the movement of the remains. And sometimes they were, moving individuals from mass graves to give them a more, a more individual grave and identifying who they were. So we had a couple times where we had to be part of that, and I was very good at avoiding it. Meaning not being right up front for it, because those are just things that I probably didn't want. But I know a lot of my friends were impacted by it significantly. I didn't necessarily volunteer for that duty, but others often ended up doing it more than I did, right? And you could see the impact, and that was just watching something like that. It's amazing how inhumane man can be to each other, right? So.
Well, I mean, you mentioned the ethnic conflicts that they dated back hundreds of years too. These were not new things, and they were also partly religious as well. And
Mhm.
it's very unsettling, I'm sure, to realize, but also it must be kind of frustrating because you're not going to solve things or help settle things that have been going on for hundreds of years, right?
No, absolutely not. And it's that's another thing that stuck out to me was, you know, the understanding the connection between culture and religion there, and you know, and some of the nuances between that, right? So, if you're Croatian, you mostly identified as a Catholic, right? If you're Serbian, you're mostly identified as an Orthodox. That would be typical. But then the writing would be different. And a Serbian person, although they spoke the same language, you know, it's obviously some unique nuances in how they spoke it. But the writing was Cyrillic. When if you're Croatian, you didn't, you know, it was more the Roman writing, right? So, and then as a in Bosnia, where there were many of the people of Bosnia were Muslim, right? Then and there was different greetings. If you're in a Serbian town, you greeted somebody one way. If you're in a Croatian area, you'd say another thing. And then in a Bosnian area, you would greet people differently. And you could see the different places of worship, right? And that would kind of indicate where you had moved. And you could drive 5 minutes, and you'd see the change, right, from a mosque to a church, right? And yeah.
And how accepted probably isn't quite the right word, but how was it in terms of the local populations accepting you being there as NATO forces? And I mean, I'm assuming some people were probably very appreciative to have you there, but I assume there probably were others who were less thrilled to have you there, perhaps being seen as interfering in what was going on. Is that fair?
That's fair. I mean, most people were very like, we didn't have a lot of, you know, when I think of the time that I spent in Zagan, and I went to a few other camps, like we did a lot of transiting through different camps, and we traded off with other armies. So we got to see a good part of the country. And,
right.
You know, one of the experiences was that definitely you could see where there was animosity, and in Zagan, where we were, which was predominantly a Bosnian Muslim area, the people were very nice, and we could go running outside of the camp. It was a permissive environment, right? And I remember, you know, we did a lot of running there, and you know, there was no real, we didn't feel a major threat, you know, maybe getting run over by a car, and, you know, or something weird like that. Or if you went off the road, if there was unexploded ordnance, or, you know, something that was left over from the war, that was always a problem there. But it never felt in fear going outside of the wire there. And then, but there were some places, like when we were in Dravar, we couldn't do that, right? And it's particularly after the riots and tensions picked up. But even when we'd go on patrols, people were nice. We could go into a coffee shop and sit down and you know, have a coffee, and people were at least cordial. You could see if someone didn't like that. And there was moments of you know, where there was a great deal of tension and conflict, but it didn't seem to be everlasting, and you know, and people were willing to have dialogue sometimes as well, and it was really neat to have those conversations with people. And it was, you know, there's many that, you know, the interesting thing I had was, you know, often being on a patrol there, and I'd run into people that were Canadian. I remember running into two girls, and I was in a town called Livno. We're on a foot patrol, and they were from Oakville, and they invited us down to sit down and have it, you know, and talk to us. And they were visiting their family, right? Because there's a very deep connection. There's many people from Croatia and Serbia that live in Canada, right? So, and that was neat. And as Canadians, you know, one of the great prides of being Canadian, they see that flag on your shoulder, right? And you know, you do have a lot of, you get respected, right? And that was really, you know, a great part of doing the job, and great benefit to it was seeing that respect that was given to us.
Were there any connections you kept with people that you met over there?
Local individual, not necessarily. A little bit by default. Like you know, one of my friends a good friend of mine had married an interpreter, which I didn't know until later on. You know, and which was neat. But really, you know, just those that I'd served with, right? Was But I've since been back and on traveling. I was in Croatia a couple of years ago, and it was neat to fly into Zagreb airport and, instead of walking through a place that was, very clearly militarized, they was walking through like the Gucci and Prada store, right? And
Right.
kind of on the way through duty free, right? Which is great. And you see progress and you see the impact of what we did there, right?
Right.
And, maybe that's an improvement in their lives, right? So
They have Gucci.
it indicates that if that's any way to judge things, it was a unique change, right? So, yeah, that was a real positive. And the experience was very positive. I really felt, when I came home, it was, I really felt I'd accomplished stuff, and I had a really positive impact. And yeah,
Was there any adjustment when you came home? How long were you there? 6 months?
Yeah, a little over 6 months, 7 months almost. I think
Yep.
I was calculated, it was 7 months and a bit. When I came home, it was perfect timing for me because I literally went on the pre-training for the tour. And then when I returned, I got into teachers college at the time, right? So I returned in, I think it was July, and the Army, of course, wanted to keep me employed. So I ended up teaching on a course, right? And right away. And then I went to school in September, and the adjustment, there are adjustments, and the adjustments, the downtime, that's what I found personally. Like when I had time off, I didn't know what to do, right? And that often is the piece, right, that a lot of guys feel when they do return from something like that is, you get home and you're like, okay, you relax for a couple of days, and then I'm like, oh, I got to get organized again, and I got to get ready to do my job, and it's that fulfillment that you get, and sometimes you don't always get that in civilian capacity jobs, right? And
Plus, it's all on you now. It's not just being told where to go and where to be, and
yeah, for sure.
Here's your food, and yeah, you got to take charge of your life again. So yeah,
sure, yeah. It was, yeah. I mean, coming home, I had a bit of a plan, right? And it was. So I did end up in teachers college at the time, and it was a bit of a funny story because I had applied to get into a whole bunch of things: physiotherapy, occupational therapy, medical school, and the fire department had done a bunch of testing for that as well and written their test. And because before really internet, but before email was really able to get stuff overseas, and Adam Saunders, who was another member of the regiment, he was in Bosnia with me, and I got a message through him through my dad, and my dad had sent it to some headquarters. And and the broken telephone, it was, "You've been accepted on the fire department. Congratulations!" And I was like, "Oh, what do you want to say?" And I said, "Well, tell my dad I said yes, right, or something like that." And I can reconvey the message to me that was in Dravar at the time. And then when I actually got hold of my dad and phoned him, is you get one phone call a week or something like that. And we were pretty austere, so he had to use like a satellite phone and stuff. It was really complicated. And he's like, "No, you didn't get on the fire department he goes, you got on the teachers college. You want to go?" And I forgot that I'd applied to teachers college, right? And I was like, "Oh yeah, I remember that." So I said, "Yeah, sure, I guess I'll go," right? And I debated staying in the regular force or staying in with 1RCR because incredible guys there, and I had such a great bond and friendships there, and I really enjoyed it, and they offered me a great opportunity, and should I have stayed, and and I didn't. But the funny part was many didn't actually know I was a reservist because I was wearing an RCR cap badge.
Right.
And
didn't exactly stick out.
So it was a bit of a shock when we came back in July, and everyone's like, "Oh, we'll see you in September after leave." And I said, "No, you won't." And I said, "Wait, you're a reservist, right?" And I was like, "Yes." And so it was that was kind of neat to be in disguise, but it also goes to show,
exactly
that a reservist, like how, sometimes that animosity there was not really required, right? So
we for one of my cadet corps, I had Rod Padden, who you'll know from the regiment as well, who came up to talk about his time in Croatia, and
right.
he had a pretty fascinating experience there, including one day where he got called off to a meeting, and his deputy had, from I think a Swedish officer or something, had to go, and his Jeep hit an IED and he was killed. And so that's the there but for the grace of God go I kind of approach. But Rod said he came back and he thought everything was fine until one day he was walking down the street with his wife one evening, going along the sidewalk, and she started to cut across the corner on the grass, and he tackled her onto the sidewalk, and then realized, of course, because of the danger potentially of landmines or whatever else, right? And he said that's the point that he realized he probably needed to go talk to somebody because
yeah, no, and that's the thing, right? Because then I remember playing golf the first time I came home, and you know, that was kind of a, you know, you had to get used to walking on the grass, I guess. You know? Not really grass there, but we had a few moments where if our vehicle went off the road, then it became a big deal because that was where the threat was, and so you had to do, you know, get extracted or, you know, safely get cleared out, like have the engineers come and make sure that you can move the vehicle, because that was probably the biggest threat, was this legacy ordnance that was there from really the 90s conflict, and then I would say World War II as well, right? So
which in some ways might have been more dangerous because it was older. And
yeah, absolutely, and there was a lot of that there, right? So I mean, and so yeah, I get that. I didn't, you know, suffer from that too much, but you know, there was a few moments where I definitely you know, could feel a little bit of that for sure.
Yeah. So you're back now. You get your master's in education. Was it your master's? I guess.
Yeah, a Bachelor of Education.
And your Bachelor of Education. You're now get hired on at the Peel board where you're still working, and you kind of go crazy with your training, right? Recce, Rappel Master, Basic Mountain Ops, Jump Master courses. So you're now a sergeant, but you were a sergeant. No, you said you were sergeant qualified before, right? So
yeah, I was a master. So it was. I came back from Bosnia, and it took some time to actually get promoted. I was supposed to be a Master Corporal, but I'd come back. They made me I was a private the whole tour, right? And then when I returned, I was a corporal, and then there was something with paperwork or whatever it was to get me to Master Corporal. So I was promoted to Master Corporal, I think in 98, early 98. And then I went, and then I finished Teachers College, and then I came back to the Queen's Own as a Master Corporal.
And interestingly, as your progression and connections with parachuting go on, you become the Parachute Ops NCO. That probably gave you a lot of background that's going to be helpful later on in your career.
Sure. Yeah. It was, you know, the great thing, the interesting about the Queen's Own is, you know, when I returned, the parachuting component, you know, was still going strong, and really, you know, I'd been gone hadn't jumped for a couple of years, right? Three years maybe. And when I returned, it was great to see. And of course, gentlemen like RSM O'Halloran were the linchpins there, and really keeping it going. And it was great to see. And I could not wait to jump again. And that was really important for me. And I, within a couple days of transferring back, I got to get under canopy again, and I was so happy. And it was a Griffin jump. It was beautiful, right? And then just got back into the swing of things. And the great thing was I had some time. You know, I just started my career, but you know, one of the benefits of being a teacher, and I didn't really know that at the time when I got into the profession, was that I had some time to take courses. So yeah, I had a couple of years of going strong with courses, and once I got enough jumps to go on the Jump Master, I went on that promptly, and then I went on Rappel Master and Basic Reconnaissance, and I taught on courses as well. I was concurrently teaching on Machine Gun course, and in the summertime on basic courses as well. So you know, it's one of the great parts of being a rifleman is opportunity to improve your skills, and especially those secondary skills that really build confidence and competence, right? So.
We probably should have said this right from the beginning, of course, but I would assume a lot of people don't even know this, but the Queen's Own Rifles has a tasking to provide a jump company, and not at the same scale, but it started in 86, 85, I think.
83, yeah.
83, sorry.
Yeah.
When they tried to start a separate jump unit, and then it came over to the Queen's Own, and we've had that ever since. And so that's why we kind of have some pretty unique opportunities that perhaps other regiments may not have to the same extent. Were there any particular things that you can say were a benefit from your experience in Bosnia that helped you in this time period when you're back at the Union?
Yeah, I think it gave me credibility, right? You know, the fact that I'd been on an operation that had some intensity within that, you know, tested me and helped me hone some skills and have some experiences. It definitely gave me some credibility with my peers, right? There'd been other members that had served in Bosnia as well. And, that was helpful, right? And also allowed me to be a good instructor, because when I taught, I love teaching on courses, and that was one of my passions. And I taught on a lot of courses, and it's the application, right? And when you can give some relevance and some
Right.
personal anecdotes to it, I mean, it really helps candidates learn, right? And so yeah, there's definitely a benefit from that, and I was very proud of that experience. And you got to temper it sometimes. It's not all about how great you are in your experiences, but at the same rate, you can use it to your advantage as well, right? So
You then took a CIMIC course. Can you just explain to people what CIMIC is? And
yeah, I took the CIMIC course. It was called this Civil Military Cooperation, and it was part of the influence activities or the information operations side of the Army, which really since the late Bosnia days was something that was becoming more and more important, and it was how we interact with civilian populations and those that support them, right? So the police forces and the politicians and the political structures. And CIMIC often provides a variety of different functions. Really on the battlefield, it would the initial intent was to do surveys and assessments of damage and to see potentially where some supports could come from, either supporting NGOs and non-government organizations, or supporting, through the military. And more often than not, we don't always have the resources to do it, but we can identify a place that might need support. And so the CIMIC course was about 2 weeks long. It was an interesting one in that, you learn how to do these assessments and work with language assistants, and then run a CIMIC house, which is basically a walk-in center where people may come there to, and I think a lot of it came from the time when the Canadian Forces was in Germany, and there was maybe some damage to property, and so someone had somewhere to go, and you'd have to manage okay, well, what happened here? Well, someone drove their tank through my field. Okay, well, here's some money, right? And
right.
there's a little bit of that going on as well, but that, and that's, I think, where CIMIC evolved from. But especially within the Afghanistan experience, the role of CIMIC in influence activities became very important, and they saw the benefit, and call it a force multiplier or whatever you want. But because you're dealing with civilian populations, because you're dealing with displaced persons, the role of CIMIC and PSYOPs and anything that has influence or information, is crucial in that type of warfare, right? So. But yeah, the CIMIC course was a fantastic one, and I took it because as things were progressing, and Afghanistan at the time was not necessarily heated up. Canadians had been over there, and then the tour was mostly in Kabul, and there was stuff happening, and I was interested in deploying. So the CIMIC course was going to increase my odds in deploying, and then as time went on, you could see that the CIMIC courses that the deployments were picking up, particularly when Canada moved from Kabul down to Kandahar. Once that started, I was very interested in going, and the Canadian Force was very interested in using CIMIC on those task forces. And so there's many of us that actually became CIMIC qualified and deployed on the same deployment, Task Force 308 to Afghanistan.
So we can talk about that too now. It's 2007. You're a warrant officer now.
Mm-hmm.
You decide to take a leave of absence and deploy on service again.
Mm-hmm.
This time, clearly not a peacekeeping or even a peacemaking operation. So what led to that particular decision?
Several reasons. Number one, I was morally driven to serve in Afghanistan. I felt that that's where my country was fighting, and that they needed. I thought I could make a contribution, right? And that was part of the driving force. The second one was as casualties started to pick up in Afghanistan, I knew many of the guys just from having been in the Army for a long time, and there was a couple casualties that really hit me hard, that I guys that I'd been on courses with, or that I that I'd worked with over the years, or one fellow that I had trained. And so, you know, I really felt compelled that I needed to go. It wasn't an easy choice to make, because at the time I still had had a young family. My son was born in 2006 as well. So, you know, I felt, you know, compelled to go, and I started applying for to go to Afghanistan in early 2005. And by the time, you know, the task force that was going in the key evolution of task forces that was happening was for Task Force 308 that left in 2008. So I started the workup training for that really early. It was 2007 we started the individual workup training, and we started meeting as a CIMIC group. So I was deploying as a member of CIMIC. CIMIC grew from, I think it was 18 members in October of 2007. So at the time we were part of what they call area troops, and at the time, Major Peter St. Dennis was the OC of CIMIC.
Mm-hmm.
We had many, there was Chief Warrant Officer, who became one of the RSMs, Mark Shannon, who was with us, Warrant Officer Ineshu Kim, Sergeant Bill Payton. There was Jay McGibbon, who was over with us, Corporal Lee Harrison as well. Just to mention a few that were all part of the CIMIC group that was the originals of deploying. So we had a large component from the Queen Zone getting ready to go. And in January of 2008, we went to Petawawa, and we were with 2 CER, because CIMIC fell under what they called the Provincial Reconstruction Team, which was housed in Kandahar. And as soon as we got there, very clearly the Canadian Forces and the task force saw the value of CIMIC. It's a hard thing to sell because it's a new thing, and it was really tough for commanders to understand. Some really got it and saw the importance, and then others didn't quite get it, and we were proving ourselves as well. But it was growing, and they kept expanding our role, right? Expanding our numbers, and we went from 18 to the time that we deployed in August 2008. We walked in there, I think, with 84 people as part of our CIMIC company. So, and the growth was exponential, but it was really interesting growth as well, because it was coming from different places, right? We had members of the regular force, both the Air Force and the Navy, that joined us. And then we had a group called the Joint JDCCs, which were information centers, and they were mostly individuals that were purple trades, communication specialists, but from all 3 branches that joined us as well. Not always in those jobs that would go outside the wire, but they played a crucial role in that experience. But yeah, it was quite the experience. The workup training for us started in Petawawa, right, with 2 CR. We ended up, I think, about 6 weeks in Texas. I realized when we got to Texas, we were in El Paso, Texas, and Fort Bliss, which is kind of shared with New Mexico. But, you know, CIMIC didn't really have a situation. You know, we took over we joined 2 CR, but the equipment that we required to do our job really wasn't there. So I was the operations warrant, and at the time I was really doing a lot of trying to build what we had, right? So we went over to Texas, and it was the Queen. It was the one thing, like, and it's.
Sorry, Scott,
Yes?
we lost you there for a second. You were saying one of the key things, and then.
Oh, okay. So one of the key benefits to being a rifleman was those, and having them on tour with us, was the skills, right? And so when I was over there, I could rely on my riflemen, and incredible things would happen. We showed up with workup training with really not a lot of resources, and the plan was limited because we just showed up, and off we went to Texas. But, you know, Bill Payton and Ineshu Kim and Mark Shannon and Lee Harrison, they all stepped up to the plate and helped me out, and we made it work, right? And we were growing at the same time, and we put on some excellent training for our guys, despite some challenges that we had and limitations, but we made it happen. And so after about 6 weeks in Texas, we left, and then we came back to Petawawa. And then we were off to Gagetown, and we did some work in Gagetown for a couple of weeks. Because when we were deploying, we were within the PRT. We had a 2RCR, a Gulf company of 2RCR was one of our force protection groups that was there, and we'd work with them a little bit in Texas, but we wanted to work with them some more just to kind of make sure that we could operate well. And then we had a time of individual training just to get the drivers qualified on the vehicles, on the RG35s, and then on the weapon systems, the remote weapon systems that we predominantly used. And after that, we went to Wainwright, Alberta. And so we were in Wainwright for, I think, 5 years. No, it felt like 5 years. But, you know, we did the big confirmation exercise took place in Wainwright. And after that, a lot of us had the opportunity to go on different courses. I went on some courses in operating with NGOs, and which is a really positive experience as well. So, and then once that was complete, we had a bit of leave, and then we deployed. And I always remember before I deployed, it was a bad summer for the Canadian forces over there. And, you know, I'm trying to rationalize and explain to my wife, you know, that like, hey, look, you know, I'm going. And then literally when every time I'd have a conversation, I'd turn the news on, and, you know, they've been, you know, and it wasn't just one gentleman, right? I mean, one soldier being killed over there, was multiple ones, right? So, you know, it's getting uneasy. And my biggest challenge, really in deployment was, you know, leaving my family, but looking at my son, who was a year and a half, right? And looking at him I remember on the driveway, and, you know, kind of going, wow, you know, so many, you know, and at the time, I think three engineers had just been killed in Kandahar, and looking at my son going, wow, this is like my last time I might see him. This could happen. This is real. You know, this is scary. And so, you know, and Naishu Kim was there when I was doing that, and he said, that's the hardest thing that anyone could ever do. He reminded me, and he reminds me of that to this day, but I do remember that. And, you know, I had a lot of good reflection before I went, and you know, I had, prior to going, I wrote my will, and I always remember sitting beside the Credit River where I love to fish, and I wrote this will, and I was, you know, trying to explain to my son, right, like who I am, right, in case something happened. And it was a great activity of self-reflection, right? Mm-hmm. And just kind of say, hey, look, you know, and I gave my letter to my friend, and I said, put it in your safe, right? And if anything happens, you know, you can give it to my son when he's 16. And so
you mentioned having to leave your family there in the driveway, and I have a picture. I have a grandfather who was killed in World War II, and he was in the medical corps. And he was kind of older when he left, and so he had 4 kids. My father being the oldest of them, at I think probably the age of 11 or something. And there is a picture of them at their cottage, which was down near Brighton, Presqu'île Provincial Park area. And there's a picture of my grandfather in his uniform getting into the car to leave to go back to Toronto, at which point he was going away. And that was the last time that he had seen his family as well, and his kids. And so I can picture in my mind, because I have that picture.
Yeah, no,
a generation apart, but yeah. And I'm sure it's happened time and time again.
It's yeah. No, I totally understand. Yeah, yeah.
You, just before we go on to that, I'm just wondering, with the Peel board, you took a leave of absence. Were there any challenges with that, or was that fairly straightforward?
No, they were amazing and incredibly flexible, right? So like one of the things that happened was, you know, I was trying to figure out how it works, and, you know, and the stars weren't necessarily aligning for me to take like a year off exactly, you know, from September to September, where the leave didn't quite work that way. But I was on a leave of absence for, I think, about a year and 9 months. And so, and they were flexible because I actually had to go and do a course for 6 weeks. Then I returned to my job. Then I deployed, right? Or then I started my pre-deployment training. And in that, we were supposed to be back in February of 2009. That was when, you know, I told in my letter that I'd written in 2006, you know, hey, you know, I'm going to be returning on this date. And then when we were deployed, they said, you know, oh yeah, you'll be back in February. And what ended up happening was we didn't come back till May. So that was, but I remember I was in a combat outpost Hutal, and you know, we had some connectivity, but I'm trying to tell my employer, right, that I'm not going to be able to, you know, make it to, you know, I'm not going to be back until May, right? And I always remember sending the email to a friend of mine that was, you know, a superintendent at the time, and I said, look, this is what's going on. They looked after me, and you know, that was very helpful, because I got to return to a job, and I was very fortunate. even like my seniority and everything else stayed the same, and it was really it was a great experience and a fantastic employer in that capacity, and the support that I received was fantastic. And even since then, when I've had to take leaves, been nothing but support. So
That's great to hear, because of course Canada doesn't really have any compulsory requirement for employers to do that, and it's built on just developing goodwill and support. And it's good to know that in this case it worked out really well for you.
absolutely.
I know the comparison probably isn't going to be very exact because the roles were very different, but um, is there any comparison to your pre-deployment training for Bosnia versus Afghanistan? I guess I'm wondering, did the Canadian Army learn some things about what needed to happen, or is it easy enough, or because the jobs were so different, perhaps it's not? You are over in Afghanistan now. You're in 3 different locations that you're posted to while you're over there. I assume different experiences, one being a forward operating base. Can you kind of tell me what that was like?
Yeah, so I guess I'll just explain the basic, my generalized experience there or whatever. So when I first got over there, everyone, all CIMIC guys, the entire CIMIC companies, we worked out of a camp, not Kandahar airfield, which was a large airfield, but Camp Nathan Smith, which was in Kandahar city. And that's where CIMIC worked out of. And so that's a forward operating base in most kind of constructs, right? It's quite nice. It's quite well done. It's in the middle of the city, and it's the one that they used to joke around having the swimming pool and having a fountain, and I think the engineers did it on purpose, but it was so we worked out of that camp, and that's where the OGDs were. So the organization, government organizations worked out of there, Corrections Canada, CivPol or the RCMP, etc. and so forth. And then I spent some time there. I was the ops warrant, so I was basically kicking everyone out of the door. Like we were so spread out as a unit. We were in 7 different operating bases, right? And be it combat outposts or forward operating bases. So basically the way it works is you're either a forward operating base, and a smaller level is a COP, which is a combat outpost, right? And so our different detachments within CIMIC, some of those detachments were a singular detachment that had 2 CIMIC operators and a driver and a gunner, and so that was the typical loadout. But we also had a joint coordination center that had communicators, sometimes an officer and a senior NCO that would be a walk-in center, a CIMIC house per se, and in certain areas they had those set up. So it was my job to kind of get everyone out the door. My OC, Peter St. Dennis, and I worked very hard to kind of come up with a plan to get everyone out, and it wasn't easy. At the time, the Canadian things were always changing there, and the Canadian Armed Forces, we didn't have our own helicopters at the time, and so trying to get to some of these bases and some of these operating in areas, because it wasn't always real estate that the Canadian Army was working out of at the time. So some of our guys were in a place called Spin Boldak, which is a forward operating base on the border of Pakistan, and then others were working with what became an American base in Camp Hutal, which were combat outpost Hutal. So just getting them out there was hard. It would take a week to get somebody from the PRT to Kandahar Airfield onto these other outposts. But so I did that role for about 2 months, and afterwards there was a need for me to go to one of the combat outposts as a operator and to do the CIMIC job. So I went out to Camp Hutal, which was with the U.S. Army, which was being managed by the U.S. Army at the time. And it was a small camp. It was freshly built. It was in the middle of a town. And I was there with the 2nd of the 2nd Comanche Company from the U.S. Army was there. And they had a U.S. PMT, which is a police mentor team with the Afghan police there as well. Mm-hmm. And then we had a CIMIC detachment there as well. So we had 1 vehicle and our driver and a gunner. So we'd work with the U.S. and the interoperability with the U.S. was hard at first, trying to get them to work with us. And Bill Payton was out there as well with me, and Jay McGibbon. So. And
did the U.S. Army have the equivalent kind of CIMIC organization as part of their?
No, they do have it. It just falls into different categories. They have their civil affairs organizations. They didn't have any there, so we provided their CIMIC support.
Right.
And we also provided them they fell under our task force. So they were a unit that fell under the Canadian Task Force Kandahar, and they were a U.S. battalion that was that was their role there. So we kind of were translating for them a lot and explaining to them, this is what they are, and just helping them understand how we do business, right? So that was a big part of that job. So I was out in combat outpost Hutal for about 8 weeks, and that was a really interesting experience because we were the furthest west you could be in Kandahar, and there's a lot of conflict going on there, unique conflict at that, and we dealt with a lot of bombings and suicide bombings, and there was a lot of different attacks on local nationals as well as on the Afghan police and contractors and stuff. And anytime we tried to do something really positive to support, the Afghans, putting a roof on a school or fixing something, that was a big challenge that we had in working there, right? So, but that was my general experience in combat outpost Hutal, and then afterwards I went to Panjwai in Fob Masangar, and I worked there as well, and I kind of ended my tour there, and it was once again it was different for me because it was with the Canadian forces was there. So we would work with the armored squadron most commonly, and then also Mike Company from 3R Scar was in Spearwind Guard just down the road. So our CIMIC teams, and Naishu Kim was posted with was working exclusively with Mike Company, and then the CIMIC team in Masangar often go out on operations with either the OMLET, the Observer-Mentor Liaison teams that work with the Afghan Army, or with the RCDs.
So, as I asked with Bosnia, were there any particular things that stand out from your time there? That
yeah, I mean, there's some real, challenging experiences that I had there, and ones that some funny, some pretty crazy, and I had a couple really defining incidents for me, I guess, over there, and one of them was being at a police headquarters in just outside of Kandahar city, and when we were there, came under fire from, I'm not quite sure what it was. I still to this day can't figure it out. It was my first time really, having that experience in Afghanistan, and I just remember the chaos, right? And in that I wasn't really, I had always been prepared. I was keen for what was happening, and when it actually went down, we didn't take any casualties in that, but the Afghan police did, because they responded, and they were basically forced or coerced to go down a certain path to go check something out, and then it was booby trap and the IED there, and it had injured, I think it ended up killing a few and then injuring a few more, but we were saved by bad luck, because a Dutch helicopter that was doing like a cargo run, and I don't think they knew what it was, flew over where the firing position was for the Taliban, and once they saw that, they ran away, right? So it actually gave us and it wasn't like we called it in or anything, it just flew over. I don't think it knew what was going on, because we were really, my struggle was that working in that environment where there's a lot of civilians, and what happened was we ended up, we were en route to somewhere, we had to stop, and then we had a cordon, and then a vehicle came running at us like at high rate of speed, and we're like, okay, well, we've already been fired at in this one area, we've already had this incident take place, now this vehicle is running towards us, and there's different rules of engagement there, but if you're in imminent threat and time and space is closing in very quickly, like something's going to happen. And I always remember my gunner getting ready to open up on the vehicle, and then it stopped, and then someone got out, and it wasn't a police vehicle, but it was the police chief coming out of the vehicle to give us information about what had happened. And I thought, oh my goodness, right? I said, how could that happen? Well, I know how it could happen, but that was just so close, and then afterwards, we went back. We were able to extract ourselves and get back without anyone getting injured. But it was defining, because it made me be more prepared, and it happened for a reason, right? It happened to shake me up and make me understand that when something like that happens, it can be, you have to be ready. And so I had a few other experiences in Hutal I won't bore you with, but one of the most defining ones I had there was I was in a suicide. There was a suicide bombing just outside of our gates in Kandahar in Hutal, and what had happened was we had a bunch of warnings that there's a bomber in this market, and in the market we had worked with the Americans, and we were telling them, look, guys, we know this person is here, right? Let us define where they are better, and then let's go in there. But I don't suggest going on in a patrol there right now, because we'll be a target of opportunity. And the market was literally on the other side of the Hesco bastion of the wall from where we were. And at the time, the platoon commander said, you know what, I'm going to go, and this is what it is. I'm like, okay, well, that's fine. I said, we'll follow in if you establish a cordon. So we were getting ready to go out on patrol, and just as we were going at the gate, a few of our guys, I had Corporal Rick Chu, who is also from the Queen's Own. He was on the on top of a container where we were trying to heat our water for our shower, because we had like a ad hoc makeshift shower. We had an immersion heater in this barrel, and so Rick was up there stirring the water so it'd be warm when we got back, and then all of a sudden a massive blast went off, right? And Rick got kind of shaken up on the like almost knocked off the roof, and then we could feel the whole, everyone got shaken by it. We were behind the wall when it happened, but then we realized what had happened, and a blast, a suicide bomber had, and we found out it was the suicide bomber had detonated himself in a store, in a motorcycle parts shop. Not really a place you want a blast going on, right? And and when the Americans had, the American platoon had almost been like circled around him at the time when it happened, and I don't know if he drew them in or whatever happened, but it was utter chaos after that for about 48 hours. And so we went to respond. Our QRF went out, and there was carnage, but it was confusion, right? We had a private security company that was providing security on the gates, and also overwatch at certain points in the camp and towers and stuff. And then we had guys going out. We had to start extracting people back, and there was the U.S. soldiers. I can't remember exactly how many were wounded, but it was over 15 U.S. soldiers wounded. 2 were killed, an interpreter killed, and also there was a lot of civilians that were injured, right? And they started bringing them back to the camp, and myself and a gentleman named John Southern, who's in 2 RCHA, him and I were up on the wall giving the Americans overwatch, and just kind of, we could see what was going on, and we were standing on top of this high feature and just explaining to them, hey, go over here, I see this, I see that, and they were getting closer. And then all of a sudden, out of the, one of the private security guys, who was a former PPCLI member, Bruno Qualier, came up to me and he goes, hey, I'm going out there. I'm going to go bring back some of the wounded Americans, right? And I said, what are you doing? And he got into a gator truck, right? And he drove out the gate, and he said, just watch me, right? And I was like, what? He just did it so quickly, right? And so Bruno went out, and he picked up some of the injured U.S. soldiers and brought them back. And I couldn't believe what I saw him do. It was an incredible act of bravery. And then there was some pickup trucks that were coming in from the Afghan police. And I always remember there was a gentleman with an AK-47 on top of a roof, and I was getting ready to shoot him, right? And I remember not knowing if I should or shouldn't, because I was hearing shooting going on, because the fire that was created in the market was causing some of these secondary explosions. Right. And then, thinking, okay, I'm going to have to do this. This is what's going to happen. But I didn't, right? And I'm glad I didn't, because I later found out that was one of a police officer yet again. So I'd learned that from before. So there's that confusion, because not everyone's in uniform. And so, but I didn't know what he was doing, and it looked weird. And when I realized he had some form of garden hose, and he was trying to put out some of the flames that from a high position. So when it ended, it didn't, in the end, when I always remember looking down, and my, there was a gentleman with me, and he said, come look over here. And I looked, and I couldn't believe there was what I saw. That there was the American soldiers that were wounded, about 15 of them, right? And I'm just estimating, but we had a small ACO trailer, dual ACO trailer, that was kind of a medical infirmary. And I walked in there, and there was a couple medics working on some of the U.S. soldiers that were badly wounded, and the platoon commander lost his arm, and and just trying to provide medical support to them. And I walked in, and it was something that I thought I'd only see out of a movie, because the whole thing was full of blood, like the whole floor, as they were doing that. And then later on, they had, they brought in civilians. And then, so my guys that were there, I had Rick Chu and a guy named Casa Govea from the Rileys, and they started doing first aid. They were TCCC guys, and they did this incredible work, first aid on the civilians, right? And the Americans, were helping us, and we had 2 Chinook helicopters come in to extract the dead and the wounded at first. And then I remember seeing the Afghan police car bring in the dead, right? And they brought in the 2 dead U.S. soldiers, and they brought in the dead interpreter and some dead civilians, and they brought them in. And just looking on the face of those U.S. soldiers, seeing their buddies being brought in, right? And just like, and I was like, all right, and I just said, put the guys behind so nobody could see, because it just stopped everything. Guys are so, and understandably, how emotional that was. And so afterwards, I just, when it was all said and done, I was, reflected on that one a long time, and it taught me a few things. But, I didn't realize, after the incident took place, we had a couple, it took us a while to de-escalate from there, right? Because the U.S. soldiers, that was a big impact on that company, because they had already lost some guys. And later on, that night, we were up all night kind of doing overwatch and cleaning up and making sure everything had happened. And I think it was the following night, we had hardly slept, and I went to sleep, and someone had woke me up, one of our signalers, and he goes, they've left. And I said, what do you mean they've left? He said the Americans left because they had their ramp ceremony, basically because of the guys that had passed away. So they sent the majority of the company away. And we were monitoring some of their communications through different means, and we could hear the communication of some of the Taliban, and they were talking about the fact that they knew that the camp was vacant, except for the private security guys that were, that were Afghan soldiers, from Afghanistan, and then us. And the guy made some comment that my interpreter then told me. He said, well, they were going to attack you, but they like you guys because you have money. Right. So I was like, oh, okay, well, that's interesting. Right. So he likes the Canadians. And I was like, oh, okay, well, and anyways, that said, I mean, it was really defining for the U.S. Army at the time, or that for the guys that we were working there. And it was a big loss, not, obviously soldiers killed, but also wounded. And it was, it really impacted them. And I left the camp, about a month after that, but I know that, they erected a monument there, and they thought that was the right thing to do. That had a list of the civilians and the U.S. soldiers that were killed there as well. And I can't remember the exact number, but it was pretty substantial.
So it's interesting that really what you've described in both those situations is what, writers of every military thing have talked about, the fog of war, right? And how in the midst of things, you don't know who's coming, who's going, and even despite all our, high-level communications tools and intelligence and everything else, that fog of war can still exist even today.
Yeah, and it is, and it's still. And any other time I had an incident or over there, there was always that fog, right? And it was. There was always there's a lot of confusion going on, and that for me as a leader has always taught me to be clear and concise and keep things simple and have good control measures in it, right? Because if you don't, when things happen, it all falls apart, right?
If it's too complicated, it's just not going to hold together.
Never is. Yeah.
So, after that experience, you're back in Canada again. You're actually now doing training for other rotations at this point, I think.
Yeah, I helped. I spent some time as I think I was hired into a contract because I just returned from the tour. The Army, the area troops wanted to use me to help train the next rotation for 110, and so I was employed by them to do that job. Yeah.
And at the same time, you're also serving as a liaison officer for some repatriations.
Well, they didn't tell me that was the secondary duty of the person in that job. So as soon as I showed up, I ended up being a repatriation escort during that time. Yeah.
And I'm sure that was a challenging experience.
Yeah, that was, I mean, once again, the Queen's Own family is very tight. And, I had an experience over in Afghanistan that connects to this. But when I came off my leave, there was 3 Canadian soldiers that were killed in Afghanistan. That were killed in December when I was on my leave, and it was DeClaros, McLaren, and Rob Wilson, and they were when they were killed. The escorts that went over had ran into me at the Canada House when I was transiting back and forth, and they said, oh, you're from the Queen's Own. We met Ted Howard and Inky Kim over there. They were CIMIC guys, and they helped. Their job was the escort piece, and they looked after us, and they're incredible guys. And thank them so much for that, right? Because it was such an experience. You know, as hard as it was for us, they really made it, you know, a great, as positive as it could be. And you know, thank you, right? And I was like, oh wow, you know, that was such a. I mean, that brought me to tears hearing that. And then later on, you know, I realized, you know, the role that Ted Howard played in this, right? And, you know, Ted had been in Afghanistan on 306, but, you know, as an escort, I mean, when he was on leave, and when he found out that I was tasked with the job, Ted said, I'm going to help you out, Scott. And Ted had been in the PPCLI as well. And the soldier we brought back was Patricia. And he actually knew the section commander that was bringing him back. And we just had such an emotional moment there, you know, but, you know, he showed me the ropes, and it was very helpful that he stepped up to help me. Yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing.
Yeah.
So we get to September 2009. You've been in the ranks for 17 years, and you decide now you're gonna commission as an officer. So what made you decide that was the right move for you in your military career?
Well, I think when I was in Afghanistan, I was solving a lot of complex tasks, and I was often working with the officers, developing kind of matrix and solving problems. And a lot of the operations officer, Dave Barry at the time, and a few others were encouraging me, you know, saying like, if you can solve these problems, and you know, this is the type of thinking you can do, you should be an officer. And I was like, oh no, I didn't want to be an officer, right? And then Peter St. Dennis was a big influence on that as well. And you know, Pete and I had a fantastic relationship, and still do. But you know, over there, he's been a massive influence in my life. And he said, you know, hey, look, you know, become an officer. And Colonel Frothingham, who was the CO at the time, encouraged it. Sean Kelly, who was the RSM at the time, encouraged it. And so I decided to do it. And you know, it worked out. And somehow I found myself, you know, 11 years later in a different position, right?
So, you know, it hasn't necessarily been a hard and fast rule, but the Queen's Own have had a tradition that they expect their officers to serve first in the ranks, at least historically. Even Sir Henry Pellet managed to do 1 year before, probably a token year, but he did his year in the ranks beforehand. Sometimes traditions outlive their usefulness, but do you think there's still value in officers serving a time in the ranks before being commissioned?
I think it's helpful to the individual, right? That is going to undergo the training, because I couldn't think of going on officer training, and particularly, you know, phase 2 and phase 3 or DP1 and what they call it now, you know, and just all of a sudden being off of the street and doing it, right? I know some do a very good job at it, and I've met some incredible officers that went right, you know, came right off of City Street or whatever. But, you know, I think it just gives you some, you know, there's some benefits, right? And from doing that, and gives that's an important thing, right? So, you know, I think it just kind of helps have a good understanding of what to expect. And also, you know, as a leader, understanding what the soldier's going through as well is important, right? Because if you don't know, if you're not able to make that connection, naturally, then, you know, that lived experience is definitely going to, you know, make yourself, okay, I know that if I have them sitting in a trench this long, I'm going to have to change this up, right? So, I mean, and I think that's the value there.
And at the same time, I'm sure it gives you a sort of credibility that comes with having had that shared experience. So
yeah, absolutely. And you know, there is some credibility that comes with it. I mean, I think the higher your rank, the better, you know, the better the credibility. And, you know, I was happy. I did at the right point. I was 36, 35 or at the 36 at the time. And, you know, it just worked out. I still had some, you know, motivation in me. And I definitely, you know, my next step really was to be a company sergeant major, which was really at the time, you know, something that I'd kind of served that function a bit in Afghanistan for a while, and I was, you know, I've done it. You know, I'm pretty happy just to, you know, maybe I can use my skills and my energy doing something else, and
right.
And all I did.
At the same time, or just after that, you're also now doing security work for SNC Lavalin, that takes you back and forth to Afghanistan as well.
Right. Yes, it does. Yeah. Yeah. So I kind of have a. You know, just the Cole's notes is I was hired by the SNC Lavalin to be their security advisor, and they were working on the Dalla Dam project, which is a Canadian signature project in Afghanistan, and that had started in 2010. And my job was to, manage the security and work with the private security companies that were over there and the contractors, and basically get the project done and benefit the lives of people in Afghanistan. So it's a challenging operating environment, and most notably, we had many members of the Queen's Own that actually worked with me over there, and so once again, Anasio Kim and Bill Payton were part of my management team over there, and did incredible work. So our experience in Afghanistan made it easier, particularly because the project was centered around Kandahar, and we kind of knew how things worked there, particularly in working with contractors, and what the truth was. Because if the world of private security is interesting, and I could go on about it for a long time, but I won't. But the more experience you have over there, the more you can kind of say, okay, well, this is a problem, this isn't, and keep people alive. And ultimately, our goal was to ensure the safety of those engineers that were working for us to make that project a success. And we were successful. It wasn't easy, and I did it on a full and part-time basis. I had some flexibility. I was just basically ad hoc consulting, working on specific things, and if there's a big problem, they would ask me if I could do it, and it was a really good experience. And I got to travel quite a bit with them to go over there, and it was it was out of we had an office in Dubai, an office in Kabul, and an office in Kandahar, and the project was taking place in and around Kandahar city.
Right. So obviously your experience is going to help.
Yeah.
So I'm just going to briefly mention, because it becomes a bit of a theme for you, but in March, or so I don't know when it was, sorry, it would have been in the spring, but 2010, you are on your first Nijmegen March.
Oh,
so
right.
we end up in Europe again for a change. And for those who don't know, that's a fairly significant, not particularly military organization, but one that a lot of military organizations participate in. And you're going to go on to other great things with that team later on that we might touch on as well. So 2012, you're now running the first primary reserve basic parachutist course. Is that correct?
And it's unique in its construct. So what happened was, there had been basic parachutist course run for reservists for, in the past, right? Where the school had run it specifically in 2003 and 2004. There'd been a push for a reserve airborne capability. In order to do that, they had courses that were for reservists in the summertime. But the unique part about this was it was staffed by reservists, right? So the Queen's Own Rifles, it was exported to us to run. And so all the instructors were from the Queen's Own. And one was Sean Willard from the Hasty Peas, who was a former regular force member and had worked at the school, but he was weren't. But we were very fortunate to have that. So it was all reserve run course for reserve candidates, and within 4 divs. So there was all three members of all three reserve brigades were on it, and it helped us build our capacity as well within the Queen's Own, and those of others that will support us, right? Like those from the artillery medics that support our parachute company group concept. We were building a lot of capacity by doing that. So it wasn't easy to do, and there was pushback whether or not we were able to do it. But a lot of our instructors are very senior instructors that taught on the course and had already worked at the school or had been working at the school for a long time. So it made it easy to do. It was just kind of deconflicting their schedules and making it work, right? So
sure. And I should have said, at this point, you're now the officer commanding 60th Company. So
yes, yeah.
You've now gone from being that rifleman jumping out of an airplane for the first time to commanding the company. I'm sure that must have been pretty satisfying.
Absolutely, yeah, it was fun. Yeah, I mean, it was, for me, I finally got the opportunity to do things that I wanted to do as a rifleman, and I had great experiences, but this allowed me to bring some really cool stuff to the training, which I thought it would inject, some excellent training. And so I got to do that, and no complaints. So
It's cool.
Yeah.
You are back to teaching. You're now a vice principal, I think.
Yep.
And during part of this, you did Operation Trillium response. You planned an airborne landing on the Moose River.
Yes.
Was this one of those interesting kinds of things you were talking about?
Yeah, it was. Sometimes the Army has really good ideas, and this was really neat, I thought. And what the intent was to support the domestic operation up in Moosonee, right? And so at the time, it was General Lavoie was the division commander, and he saw the value in us doing some form of airborne operation in Moosonee, and trusted us to do it. And we'd kind of proven our abilities in many different ways, but it was a test of capability. So we had to actually register the drop zones, which were austere drop zones. But there was probably about there's three different components to it. The first one was to do a static line square in Pathfinder insertion into the Moosonee airport. And so we had to register the airport as a drop zone. And so the team, which was Bill Payton, went up and registered the drop zone. Then there was a aerial delivery component to do aerial delivery replenishment for the field force and the rifle companies that were out there. So we registered a bunch of austere equipment drop zones on different rivers in and around the Cochrane area. And then the final one was we registered a drop zone on the Moose River, which is just outside of Moose Factory, Moosonee, and that we named that drop zone De Vries after Jan De Vries.
Right.
So, yeah, and that was so what we did was we staged out of Cochrane, and our paratroopers that were already on the exercise came with us. We got met us there. I flew in with Brian Burns, one of the UEO and senior parachute instructor, and Chris Abate as well, and we conducted got the guys dressed in the airport, and we flew into Moosonee, and we conducted a double door full equipment drop onto the Moose River, and it was quite the experience up there, that's for sure.
So had they ever had to register a seasonal drop zone before?
Yeah, it could be done, and sometimes just jumping on the ice sometimes can be very dangerous, right? Yeah. And the Airborne Regiment found out that in around Lake in the 80s, and so I was very cognizant of that, and then so Bill Payton, who was the drop zone controller, and I often spoke about that. But we were very fortunate because it's an ice highway there in Moosonee, and
right. Between Moose Factory and Moosonee,
yeah, absolutely, and it had I think it was 80 centimeters of ice that was there, or maybe even more, and then on top of that was 20 centimeters of slush, and then probably powder of 40 centimeters. So, I don't, if they went out without a parachute, they might have been okay, right? I don't, but it was, the guys were heavily burdened, and there was a full ammunition rucks, rucks were easily 60, 70 pounds. And,
sure.
And, I always remember
your winter kit. Yeah.
Yeah. Corporal Neto at the time was the number one in the door, and I was dispatching that side, and he had the C6, and we had a couple, just as they were ensuring that they're on the right drop zone, we had a couple of racetracks, and the very brave young man, that's for sure. So, but yeah, we got out, and it was a wonderful day, and the guys were, once the jump took place, they did an operation, and for a couple hours, and then they moved up, and we extracted by Herc back to Toronto.
That's got to be one of your most unique jump experiences, I would assume, probably.
Yeah, it was. It was an exercise in trust. There was a lot of people who were, challenging us, and I don't think they want us to fail, but there were some great people that I worked with from the division about that, and were really helpful in making it happen. Yeah.
That's good. All right, so now you're back. I don't know, what were you doing somewhere in here? Kind of losing track a bit, but you're back as the OC for the second time with 60th Company. You're back in Nijmegen again in 2018. You were actually scheduled to be on, I think you were leading the Nijmegen 2020 team as well, or?
Yeah, I was supposed to go back this year. So yeah, within the Nijmegen, I guess, from 2015 I'll just kind of go through the chronology of it. I mean, after 2014, I become the OPSO, and I was on the AOC course to get promoted to major. I was the OPSO and the OC VIX company from 2014, 15, 16. And in that time, managing everything, and NOC para as well, like managing all the para ops and everything that we were doing at the time. So it was great. And to kind of keep myself out of trouble, I had the opportunity to do Nijmegen in 2015. And in 2017, the opportunity for the Queen Zone to bring a team came up. And that was what I did in 2010 as well. But when we went over in 2010, we were only allowed to bring 3. There was myself and 3 others that were allowed to go. We were part of a regular force team, and they weren't trusting reserve teams to go over. So in 2017,
Some things never change, eh?
Yeah. In 2015, I went over. I had the great opportunity to go over with the Toronto Scottish and work with them, and that was a really amazing experience. And originally, I was just helping them train because I had done it before, and then they had asked me to actually go with them because they had a lot of soldiers that were had to one of the soldiers had to pull off to do a course, and I was like, yeah, I'll go. I didn't really feel really ready to go. I knew what I was getting myself into, so but I got through it. And so then in 2017, my third one, I brought the Queen Zone team, and I had Jeff Johnston was my 2IC for the team, and we trained in Toronto. Toronto's one of the best places you can train for the Nijmegen March because we have this incredible lake shore, and you can stage out of Moss Park, go left or right, walk your 30-40 kilometers and come back, and the Humber River Trail, the Rouge River Trail, the Don Valley. I mean, you can go without hitting lights, and there's washrooms on the way, and you can stop and have a coffee, and there's it's just a easy place to train. And so I'm very fortunate to have that. So yeah, we brought a team of 12 over in 2017, and I had we brought over a bugler as well that did an incredible, Steve Abra, who came over and did an incredible job, playing at both Vimy and some of the other, and Grosbeak as well. So, and then after that, I got the opportunity to go as their deputy commander. So I went over in 2018 as the deputy commander, and as at the time I was working with Colonel Jeff Abthorpe, and he had been injured, and so I actually had to be acting commander on the march, which was just a great experience. He was still there to give me guidance and ran everything else, but it was a unique year in 2018 because there was an outbreak of gastrointestinal illness on the camp, and the RSM at the time and I were marching together quite a bit, and he got ill on the march, Steve McNabb, and he was I've never met a man as tough as Steve McNabb, because he had, from the moment we stepped off, he got ill, and I knew that, and he told me, and he finished the 44 kilometers that day through Grosbeak and everything, despite that, and it was impressive, right? So yeah, it was one tough cookie, but in the end, it was a great year in 2018 despite that, and I went back in 2019 with Colonel Eric Coudron and Eric Drouin as the RSM, and we had a fantastic year in 2019 where everyone finished the march. So my job as deputy commander for the 2 years, or really 3 years, but it should have been this year as well, was to guide the training of all the teams across Canada. So they often, there's Navy teams and Air Force teams and reserve teams and regular force teams. There's roughly 14 to 15 of them, and I had the opportunity to work with them and guide them through their training, kind of say, hey, look, this is what to expect. These are some training tips. You need to complete certain benchmarks, and some of that was to complete 500 kilometers of marching before you went, and then to do a back-to-back 80-kilometer march before you went. So I would follow that. If they finished that, then they would get to deploy.
Right.
With Nijmegen, yeah.
So maybe we could just stick with Europe for a minute, because you've also participated in a number of commemorative operations with the Queen Zone over there, I guess in 2017 at least, and then certainly last year, because I was there too, and I know. You, and just from watching your coordination last year, you've obviously got a lot of contacts and close friendships with the people in Normandy, and I mean, it I guess ties in with both your family connection, but also with the
Yeah.
Queen's Own. How would you describe the importance and the impact of these experiences, both for you and for the soldiers of the regiment that have participated?
Yeah, it's one of those things where I don't think you can explain it to somebody until they actually experience it, right? And I say this often with Nijmegen as well, where, you know, like when you go to Grosbeek and you actually experience that and you see what it is, then you get it, right? And then you know, and it was, you know, when I was in Normandy in 2014, I had the opportunity to jump into Normandy, and I jumped in with the Canadian contingent that 50 of us went over and jumped and with the UK, and we were in Ranville after that, and I always remember the ceremony there, and some of the members of One Can Para being there, and I was just so, you know, it was such an emotional experience for me to see that, and you know, afterwards, it was really interesting as just the history behind it. I was like, wow, this is, you know, just to walk that ground. And at the time I went to Jan de Vries Trench, right, which is just outside of Ranville, and Joanne was there, Joanne de Vries, and who's, you know, been a good friend for many years, and Joanne, you know, explained the story of Jan, and we had some very important people there see that and be part of it. And you know, so for me, every time I get to go to Normandy, I go to see Jan's Trench, and you know, that I think that's important. So when I plan a trip, that's what we do. And you know, the people of Normandy make it easy, and honestly, Canada House, the Westlake
Souvenir Brothers.
Yeah, I mean, their dedication to what we did over there and what our forefathers did there, I mean, it's impressive, and I really appreciate what they do and how much they care, and they don't want us to forget. And you know, if it wasn't for them, we wouldn't be able to do the great things that we do. And you know, and I think in 2017 with Vimy, I mean, we spent some time there and really, you know, fortify those relationships. The town of Annecy, you know, how those bonds that will, you know, will be forever in our families. Like we have those families that we connect with in Annecy, right? And when we go back, some of our guys go back and, you know, just to see them. I mean, it's such we get treated so well, and it's mutual, right? Like they want to, if somebody comes to Canada, we'll look after them here as well, right? So
I think you were trying to explain to people, and I was trying to explain to people too. And I guess what struck me as most is that particularly on this last trip last year, this would be the first time the Queen's Own had no D-Day veterans with them, and yet despite that, so and I think in all the ceremonies I visited, and I think there were a couple in Le Mans-Patrie and maybe in Giberville, there were a couple of really older gentlemen who were children in Normandy and who had lived through the invasion but for the most part, we're now dealing with people that actually have no connection to what happened anymore. The people that are living there, it's either their parents or their grandparents, or I think, was it Agoné, we stopped at the children's school, and so these would be like their great-great-grandparents probably who were involved. And in the regiment now, these would be the regimental third generation of soldiers that, you know, have taken place in this. And yet there still is this very moving connection that's extremely hard to explain. And they definitely have this they do not want their children to forget what happened. And
no, never. Yeah.
And I was very struck actually by the fact that during their actual ceremonies, the kids or young people take a much more active role than ours do here. They do more than just read in Flanders Fields, and they participate in a very real way in many cases in the ceremonies. And that commitment to not forgetting the sacrifices is pretty fascinating to me. It was, as you say, very hard to explain. I'm not sure
Absolutely. I think a lot of times they have reminders, right? They have reminders, right? So when you're a child growing up in Venice, or, you know, like, you know, and you walk through, you see the Commonwealth graves, right? That are there. You see the different monuments, right? And so you're reminded
streets named after soldiers and
by that. And, you know, and as a child, I mean, Absolutely, and I just think it's wonderful. It's such an honor for me to be part of that. And when I think of the most recent trip in 2019, and we had to say no to things. They wanted us in so many different places, and I felt bad about saying no to certain things. And that was the challenging part. I wish I could have done it all, but I don't think a trip could have gone better for us. Like, it was just such a positive experience. And once again, Canada House, Gauthier, Habernack, and
Yep.
Cole and family. I mean, from Canada House, the way they treat us and support us and make it all happen, right? Like, I would come up with a cockamamie idea, like, oh, we're gonna have a mess dinner on the beach, and they were like, what does that mean, and then I tell them what it looks like, and they're like, really? Okay, let's do it, and it happens, and it was just amazing that we were able to do that, and that when I see the end product and what actually happened, it wasn't perfect, and there was some things that, but it was a real positive experience, and for our guys to say that they were part of that, I mean, that was just very important, I think, for me, and just in the preservation of the history of our regiment and the sacrifices of some of those people that I call friends or called friends, and I think of when I was on that beach in 2019 on the 75th, and at the end of the mess dinner, I sat on that beach, and I thought of my friend who since passed, Bill Betteridge. And I knew Bill because he lived in Brampton, right?
Right.
Just down the road from my old school. And I used to visit him once in a while, and we would talk. And, and I remember, his story and him coming, to my school and showing me some stuff that he had and explaining where he was on the beach and how he maneuvered through it. And, just think of him and Charlie Martin, who I had the great pleasure of knowing, and some of our other, the Jack Hadleys and just so many of these guys that played such a role and influence in my life, and of examples of leadership, right? So it was a great opportunity to do that tribute, right? So yeah.
We have one of those portraits at the museum of the D-Day landing,
Mm-hmm.
and we've had occasions. Ed Butler is one, I think, of the D-Day vets who's come by sometimes, and he looks at it and he goes, that's a cool picture, but the beach was way longer in real life than it looks in this picture.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking, well, yeah, I guess if people are shooting at you, you're going to think the beach is a long way. And then he says, yeah, and the boats are way too close together, in this picture. It's like, all right, artistic license, whatever.
Yeah, then that's true too,
But
right?
but then you get there, and I mean, I walked out on that beach too and turned around and looked back at the thing, and you try and imagine, jumping off a landing craft, and that beach is a long beach when the tide's out, and you have to do that. And when you kind of walk along the beach to find out where the different boats landed and all that kind of thing, all of a sudden you realize, yeah, they were really spread apart. And
yeah, absolutely, yeah.
It was 30 guys who think you're trying to attack the whole German army on your own. It was pretty amazing. I also had the opportunity to, because I toured around before, to visit some grave sites. I went to Benny-sur-Mer, obviously, but I went to I never know how to pronounce it, in Belgium, where General Mercer is buried, and found his grave. But I also, the one we have the letters and diaries for that we published from one of the guys who'd been in the Queen's Own in the First World War, and then was eventually posted to the 4th Canadian Mounted Rifles. And so, I've transcribed the letters, we published them, and I was able to find his grave site as well. And it's in one of those tiny little, what do they call them, extensions, where they're kind of just a little graveyard beside the local.
Oh, right, yeah.
And there's maybe 10 or 12 soldiers, and it's still beautifully maintained by Commonwealth War Graves. And the day I was at Pridham's grave, there were some Commonwealth War Graves there working. They were redoing one of the stones or something, and so I was able to get them to take a picture of me with that one. But it does, and for guys who have their coins, sorry, somebody's decided to have a wrestle with his sister. The coins of remembrance, and they're able to find the graves of their people. It just makes that connection so much more real than reading about it or writing about it. So.
Well, for me, seeing George Hadley, and it was Bill, Fred Bernard's brother, and seeing their graves, right? I mean, their story, you know who they were, and then you actually go there. And then it's like, wow, this is like, I purposely went last time to see, when I was at Ben Isimer to go see Bill Bernard's, it was his brothers, right? And it was Fred Bernard's brothers there, right? And it's like, wow, like this is really, and the West Lakes are there as well, right?
Right.
So are the,
Yeah. And of course, the West Lakes is an
yeah,
incredible story. At least two of them are side by side, and the other one I think is a few feet away.
that's right.
Three brothers all laid to rest in the same cemetery. Amazing. I really appreciate you having taken the time. I know that you are going to be taking over as commanding officer on September 20th. Probably not the way you'd ever envisioned taking over, but socially distanced and without much of a crowd and attendance, I guess, that we've now determined. But that's life in today's situation. I just wonder, I guess, for two questions. One, just are there any particular, and this may be difficult to pick out after a long career of so far, but are there any particular mentors for you that stand out that have helped you through? I know you did mention Peter St. Denis a couple of times.
Yeah, I mean, there are some leaders that I look to in different roles, right? And I've learned a lot from everyone that I've worked for, right? Some good, some bad. And
Sure.
I hate to say it, but someone once told me that you learn more from a bad leader, right? About what not to do, but also
Sure.
it forces you to grow up a little bit, right? And so someone told me that when I was complaining about something years ago, and I was like, wow, that's a good point, and I guess when I look at the incredible leadership that I've had throughout the Queen's Own Rifles, and I mean that, right? I look at the leaders that I've had, and I look to they're my family a lot of times, right? And so as much as I think extremely highly of so many of the senior NCOs that I've worked with and that mentored me to get to where I am to this day, and officers as well. I mean, as much as I've spoken about Peter, there's some others in that journey that definitely have helped me in many different ways. I look to even my peers and learning from them as well. I look at the incoming RSM, Jeff Johnson, and I've learned a great deal about leadership from him and working with him. I look to Donovan O'Halloran, and I think when I look to the RSM O'Halloran and what the example that he set for me, particularly with the passion around para, that's someone that I definitely wanted to emulate at times or be like, and in not necessarily how I acted, but in my passion for things, and wanted to continue with. I mean, the example that he has set has been remarkable, right? A few others, that I've had the experience of watching. I remember being in Afghanistan and watching some of the RSMs and some of the company sergeant majors in action, and just saying, wow, that is impressive, right? And some people may not even think that I look at them as a mentor, right? And it's I do think very highly of so many of those that I've worked with and that I've had the opportunity to serve with, and I hope I can be a good mentor and a good leader, and maybe those experiences have made me that person. So
last question, what do you think are going to be the biggest challenges for you in taking over command of the regiment? I know that right now I think the Queen's Own, well, at least the last time they paraded, was the largest reserve militia unit in the country. Is that at least Army? And I know that was certainly as the recruiting has been a major goal in the past, but of course we also have a pandemic to deal with now, and I'm sure that's going to have some impact. So
yeah, I mean, our recruiting has been incredible. I mean, I think we found the sweet spot with regards to how we leverage social media in order and outreach to recruit soldiers and actually create a brand and an image that really can be attractive to soldiers and attract the right people. And now, the immediate challenge obviously in front of me is COVID and how we work around that. And really close some gaps. There's been some training gaps that have taken place, and the Army's been working really hard the last three months to close those gaps, but they're going to exist no matter what. So, you know, making sure that we retain those recruits, that's going to be an important part to it, right?
Yeah, there's no point in being great recruiters if you can't keep them. So.
Right, and you join the Army for opportunity, right? And you know, and you want to progress and you want to take these courses, right? And you know, to no fault of anyone's. I mean, COVID slowed that process, but you know, finding how to operate in that COVID environment, but also run these courses and pick up the pace. It's not no easy task, right? Maybe everything for a reason. I don't know, right? So I try to, like I rationalized jumping out of a plane the first time. I'm going to rationalize this one, right? So, but you know, and the things that I love. I mean, the biggest challenge with the Queen's Own is we have the great honor of having the para task, and you know, it's something that we have it's maintaining the capacity to have the capability. It's so important, and we do a really good job at it, but you know, you have to maintain momentum, and sometimes there's lulls in that get created not to any fault of our own, and we have to, you know, continue to find that. And sometimes it's a financial, administrative, and I don't know what the impact of COVID's going to be on that, right? But
well, and also much of that has been developing relationships too, right?
Yeah.
You develop relationships with the Air Force, with other parts of the Reg Force, significantly, all of which have allowed those kind of things to happen. And hopefully that COVID doesn't impact those too much, but it's hard to know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's, you know, relationships are the key. And when time goes on and we don't do much, you know, there's just a kind of a natural decay that goes on, right? So we need to, you know, we're getting there. We're getting into a place where we can start training and doing good things, but you know, it's not going to be what I envisioned as a change of command, and I'm okay with that. You know, I'm not really a pomp and you know, circumstance kind of guy, so I would have been very happy doing it on a drop zone, but so. But yeah, I mean, there's challenges ahead, and there's the secondary effects of COVID and you know, on mental health, on structure and function and budget, maybe, you know. So I mean, there's challenges that are going to exist there, and you know, what I'm happy about is an incredible group of soldiers that work with riflemen, right? That work with us, and from the company commanders down to the privates that get it, right? I mean, I just look at the cooperation, you know, with our social media, as silly as, you know, social media may sound, everyone is bought in to share the story, right? And when you know, if a soldier's doing a task somewhere and he's got some really great photos, he'll send it to us, right? And he'll tell it, he knows the game, right? And you know, and that's really reflective even in the recent edition of the Rifleman that's coming out, and the great work that everyone has done in contributing to it, right? So, and sharing that message about what a great regiment and what a family we are, really.
All right. Well, it's been a long conversation, and I appreciate you taking your time, and certainly want to wish you all the best. I'm pretty sure I'm not one of those 50 that gets to make the short list, so I'll be looking forward to.
I think I might be, but we'll see.
Well, as long as they don't pass you your
that's right,
on a stick or something. I hope that's not part of this one, but we look forward to working with you for the next. Well, I'm not making any commitments how long I'm the curator, but for at least the time we're doing this together, I look forward to that, and appreciate you taking the time to talk to us today. Thanks very much.
All right, thank you.
All right.